This is the tragic tale of a character once at the top of the food chain, only throughout the course of time to become more and more obsolete. In this video, we're going to explore the past and present of Venti, the most nerfed character in Genshin Impact. Genshin Impact was released globally, and during the time, this was the game everyone was stuck at home playing. Even if you personally never played the game, you at least knew someone that did. Nowadays, the early age of Genshin Impact is considered the Wild West era of the game, and for many players, they either stuck around or have stopped playing, which is normal behavior in most video games. Now, what set Genshin apart from most games is that it was a gacha game, which is ridiculed by many as being predatory, and that was made the general consensus early on. Nearly every single gacha game is kept afloat by creating itself a live service model. Live service meaning something constantly being updated as days go on. Whether the downtime between updates is days, weeks, or even months, the game is constantly being updated to keep the player engaged. Through the live service model, Genshin Impact has been consistently releasing characters in the timely manner that the team has explicitly promised to the audience that they would, and this content is referred to specifically as patch cycles. But for the purpose of this video, we're gonna focus on the banners. Genshin Impact had a 4-banner gacha system at launch. It gave the game a lot of variety, consisting of a standard banner that never cycled through patches, but was later updated following the releases of certain characters. The second banner being a 2-time discounted banner for new players, which as time went on seemed lucrative to the general player base. The third banner, which consisted of a time-limited character, and that character's signature weapon was the final banner in the gacha system, which also rotated with the limited characters. The first banner at the global release of Genshin was Venti, who was the god of the first region in the game, Mondstadt, and the game referred to those gods as archons. With great responsibility of that title came great power, and for the first godly character to be released in the game, Venti absolutely was crushing all of the game's contents that was offered at the time. What made Venti so impressive at the time was his ultimate having 100% uptime, and that was a mini black hole, bringing everything to the center of it and refunding energy to every single ally in the party, while being an offender of one of the most broken support artifact sets in the game. He was also a mainstay in every player's team because his utility outside of combat made the overworld exploration a breeze with him. And if you had Jean or any other animo user in the same party, then you not only traversed at max speed, but you also were easily able to reach off the ground surfaces easily. Venti was a game changer for co-op because having one in the party allowed all dungeons and farming-esque parts of the game to be trivialized due to his mechanics. If there was a Venti owner in the party, then the time spent in the match was greatly reduced. He could do some decent damage to the squishier mobs at the time, and grouping enemies constantly means you could save time from running around, which wasted stamina for characters like Kashing who depended on using stamina for attacks. And if there wasn't a Venti owner in the party, you would just spend much more time in matches due to mobs having higher HP pools in co-op. He was really just that strong. It wasn't long before the developers realized that something had to be done to ensure Venti just wasn't going to be a balancing issue long term. And it wasn't completely their fault, as the starting roster in most video games are typically the ones that sneak past the betas being very powerful because there isn't any previous benchmark to balance characters off of. Couple that with the fact that he was the first overworldly being and banner in the game. It was only natural he had to leave a great impression to the mass audience that was cultivated at the time. But once again, miHoYo knew that something had to be done because they directly couldn't nerf any character, which would cause commotion and controversy for the small and ambitious company. I mean, you as the player would see Venti nerfs as bait and switch at the time of launch if you were new to the gacha game genre, and considering most of the player base didn't even know what gacha mechanics were, myself included, we would have seen a big uproar had that came to fruition. So miHoYo had two options: either directly send nerfs to this character's way, which would have caused too much short-term noise for the company, or the other way, being indirect nerfs over the course of time that would make the character appear more obsolete than he actually is. And well, if you know the type of company miHoYo is today, do you know exactly what decision they ultimately made? In the start of one of the biggest gold pandemics came a little mischievous, elf-eared Isekite, the daughter of one of the most famous adventurers in Tevat. Klee, for short I guess, was a character that brought a lot of attention to Genshin Impact, unwarranted attention. She was a pyro damage dealer and an early limited 5-star. She had a lot of competition when it came to pull value in terms of account progression. But her biggest selling point was the cutesy appearance with the giant elementary schooler looking backpack. Klee was compared to Diluc, who was the strongest damage dealer at the time, and Klee, being a pyro character much like him, didn't do her any favors. With Venti in his prime time as the leading supporter in team compositions, following the release of this underwhelming character, the cracks began to show. Klee's main source of off-field damage was her little dodo bombs, and Venti, being the premier vacuum animo support, he was unfortunately unable to find any synergy with the little red elf, as his ultimate was unable to pull the dodo bombs to the center where enemies will be pulled into. That would be a wombo combo, and considering Klee was mostly area effect when it came to her kit, it was a missed combo between the two limited characters. You could, however, theoretically still use the two characters together, but the limitation of Venti was further reiterated once Sucrose, an easier to achieve anima 4-star supporter, had full synergy with Klee. A lot of players at the time was outraged by the performance of this character and her anti-synergy with Venti, due to the nature of limited characters already being rather expensive due to the low amount of premium currency given to the players, and considering miHoYo's no buff policy for characters in Genshin Impact, it was a super disaster. Players were outraged mostly about Klee being the worst limited 5-star at the time, but most players failed to understand that the Venti and Klee combination was a fault of the animo archon, not the little mischievous girl, and fast forwarding to current era Genshin Impact, this aged perfectly. This was only the beginning of the end for the little bard, as miHoYo wanted to step down on his supreme reign, but there was more that had to be done, and there would soon be another limited animo support character that had, just like Venti, had an overwhelming amount of pull value. Following Klee's rerun banner and the start of the third region added to Genshin Impact, later on to be known as Inazuma, another limited animo support was released and his name was Kazuha. At the time, I was a new player in Genshin Impact, but I had no idea who this character was, but his airborne wind technique seemed intriguing, and through word of mouth, I heard he was an amazing support for most teams in the game. At the time, Venti was the character that many of the people still regarded as being top tier. He had the kit that synergized well, the supporting capabilities, and a prime element that was very flexible, so Kazuha had a lot to deliver as he was up against stiff competition already. Kazuha could go airborne just like Venti could, allowing traversing with him to be a breeze, literally. Kazuha also had the good damage of a character like Venti, and it helped that they both shared the same build path and the same artifact set. Kazuha, however, had some things Venti didn't have, a team-wide up to 40% damage boost for the elements he swirled. That made Kazuha a more appealing character in many teams that needed the last character in the composition to swirl elements for the resist shred. And Kazuha doing that also provided further damage to the teams he was in. Heck, one of the most lasting teams in the game utilizes Kazuha as the last slot, not Venti, who is arguably stronger lore-wise. Kazuha also has synergy with a character we mentioned early in the video, Klee. Remember the dodo bombs Venti couldn't suck? Yeah, well, Kazuha was able to group those bombs up with the elemental skill and increase the elemental damage of Klee while providing elemental resist shred as well. He was Klee's best friend, really. He was just about everyone's best friend. For the majority of Venti owners at the time, the arrival of Kazuha was a game changer. It meant that already great teams became even better, and it also meant what miHoYo sought out to do was working as intended. You could definitely say the ease of use for Venti is an interchangeable strength of his, but Kazuha is arguably the same in terms of skill depth as well, so I can't even agree with that statement whatsoever. One thing that always remained the differentiating strength of Venti was the fact that he could permanently group small mobs in the center point of the screen, which allowed him to find value in all of Mondstadt and Leeway. Even the Spiral Abyss, which was and currently is the hardest contest in the game, Venti still had the skills tipped in his favor because he trivialized the contest that was offered, still ongoing to 2 years at that point. And following the release of Kazuha, miHoYo realized making a better Venti for certain team compositions wasn't enough to stop his ongoing rampage, but yet something else needed to be done in order to put him down once and for all. Not characters, but his ability to group everything is what would convince the small indie company to shift the contents of the game in a different direction, including the enemies in the game as well. Inazuma, the third region in Genshin Impact, released, and at the time this was amazing because this was the first ever live release of a new region that the players got to experience. It was also the first region to be quest locked from the players, which meant you weren't able to access it unless you reached a certain point in the game. I remember being a new player around this time, and upon seeing the spike in difficulty from this region in comparison to Mondstadt and Leeway, it makes total sense why it was inaccessible for newer players. The enemies were bigger, stronger, and had a lot more weight added, so this meant only one thing for the animal archon. For once, he was rendered powerless. You could still use him, but it wasn't the best experience for anyone that brought him because the weight difference for mobs in the older contents was just that big. This promoted a Kazuha-centric environment because he could at least slightly pull enemies towards the center and still provide massive damage buffs to the team. And considering the overall health pools were increased for the mobs, he started to see more and more play over Venti in nearly every single team. To be fair, every other Animo CC inducer felt the indirect nerfs because they had trouble with crowd controlling the newest Inazuma mobs, but Kazuha definitely was the one to struggle the least overall with these new changes. You could argue that this was a healthier change overall because some damage dealers that had issue with staggering enemies found a lot more play in Inazuma, but it was the beginning of the end for our little bard. Over time, the amount of enemies that were immune to the crowd control effects started to rise more and more, which meant having Venti in your team compositions was an overall DPS decrease versus Kazuha, who could at least give more damage to the team. And this brought about a small amount of discourse in the community, because for many people, the difficulty spike was a little too high. Considering the influx of new players for the big release of Inazuma, MiHoYo was put in a tough predicament at the time because they knew that this was harmful to both the old-timer player and the new one as well, because for the older players that had Venti, he felt obsolete. And for the newer player, well, you fought against taller enemies that were harder to stagger, often leaving the player frustrated at times. The company knew all of this, and over time the problem just gotten worse to the point that something had to be done, because with a mostly casual audience and wanting to appease new players long term, the progressively frustrating enemies needed a little bit of tweaking in the favor of everyone, and this would be the best changes they had ever done. Roughly a month and week later, 2.1 was released in Genshin Impact, and the patch notes lied some of the best changes ever brought to the game.
And lastly, it reduces the weight of the Nobushi and Kairagi. So I think point 4 is the one that really nerfs them really badly, and this only applies to Anemo users, especially Venti.
Nobushis were no longer able to jump back, which allowed the players to group the enemies towards the center of Kazuha more reliably. But the next change, which was a reduction of weight for both the Nobushi and Kairagi, allowed Venti to be brought back in once again and be much more valuable in team compositions once more. Considering one of his best teams was Ayaka Freeze, who was a character that was released in 2.0. He was able to funnel energy to Ayaka, and he was able to group enemies towards a center point, which for a damage dealer such as Ayaka was a game changer. She had too much staggering with both her ultimate and elemental skill, and considering she was an all-area effect character, Venti would become her best teammate, that is still very much so to this day. Venti would then see more play in Spiral Abyss alongside Ayaka and Mona being one of the best teams in the game at the time, and would then on continue to be a very valuable character for a long time. Although Venti owners were once again having the time of their life, MiHoYo still was unsatisfied with how the little bard trivialized the contents in the game. Following the indirect buffs, something had to be done, and the following changes is what leads us to where we are today, the present Genshin Impact era. Genshin Impact had its next biggest region update. The land of Sumeru brought a bunch of variety to the game, and MiHoYo very much so strived to spice things up in 3.0, and man did they deliver. Dendro was a new element introduced to the combat system. It was always in the game, often appearing in the form of Dendro slimes, but this new element was an update to the elemental combo experience in Genshin Impact, one that was very tragic for the Animal Archon. Now, to play devil's advocate here, he ended up working very nice with the Dendro cores, which, contrary to the Dota bombs Klee had, could be suckable. Now in 3.0, there was many changes to the game, with some of them being enemies in the game that are impossible to group, and for a character known for his sucking capabilities like Venti, this was a death sentence. With Dendro becoming a meta-defining element, there would be an update to a lot of team comps, and new comps would also be formed, but most if not all of them excluding Venti in those teams. This was the ultimate nail in the coffin for Venti, as the Dendro element couldn't be swirled, and while most enemies in the harder contents were unable to be grouped as they had massive weights, much bigger than the early days of the Inazuma, Nobushi, and Kairagi. Considering Dendro was the newest element and content the game had to offer, MiHoYo pushed the element really hard, And with the Dendro Archon on the way, our poor Bard would soon become obsolete once again. Kazuha continued to find value regardless because of his elemental damage boosting capabilities and him working very well alongside the electric and hydro elements, which was a big selling point of the newest Dendro elemental interaction. Many players were once again distraught because that meant a shift in the meta. Promoting newer characters of the Dendro element was unavoidable, and for those of which were Venti mains, that would ultimately leave the Animal Archon in the position he is in currently, an undesirable one at that. With Ayaka, however, still remaining a top tier character thanks to her amazing multipliers baked into her ultimate, he could still arguably have a place in the meta, but with the constant release of enemies that are unable to be grouped, he would be trading places in his best teams with someone else that suffered from these same issues but still provided a very valuable damage boost to the team. Today, Venti would find himself being talked about less and less, often being referred to as a relic of the past, and I unfortunately can't agree with that statement. The best thing about Venti at this point is that he is still god tier for exploration, and he gives invaluable value to the player's emotions of joy whenever he is brought in events. Between his cheesy and often kiddish personality, nostalgia for the player, and the fact that even at his worst, any content that calls for him is often a clean sweep because at his best, he is one of the best characters in the game. I feel that's very fitting lore-wise. With the release of the latest region Fontaine, Venti could very much so find a cozy spot in the meta. Enemies could end up being a lot squishier and easier to vacuum versus those in the jungles of Sumeru and the land of Inazuma, but for that we'll have to wait and see. He at least still makes an amazing ally in the exploration of every region. But if Fontaine has many underwater areas of exploration and or steers away from land traversing, then one of Venti's best selling points may then become another one of his worst. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. I believe this is the best way to summarize the history of Venti, a character who once reigned supreme, only to not age like fine wine as Genshin Impact progresses more and more into the end game. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what character you would like to see next in the comment section down below. I kinda have an idea who I'd like to make a video next, but I would love to hear your input as well. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day. Peace.